The thought hit Clara May Callahan hard as she pressed her back against the rough timber wall of the Dry Creek Town Hall, gasping as if the wooden planks were closing in around her. The music didn't stop. The fiddles kept laughing bowstrings scraping bright and sharp above the stomping boots on the dance floor. Lanterns swung overhead, throwing gold and amber light across the crowd. But to her, it all looked blurred, distorted like heat rising off desert stone. Her palms trembled as she grabbed the nearest chair to steady herself. She didn't sit. Couldn't. Sitting would mean staying. Staying meant hearing more of the whispers that were already circling her like hungry buzzards over a wounded doe. Poor thing. She really thought Beau would pick her. Well, Pearl Duval's daddy owns half the railroad. What do you expect? The words weren't loud. They didn't have to be. They found her anyway. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Not in front of him. Beau Whitaker stood no more than 10 feet away, tall and polished in a tailored charcoal suit that didn't look like it came from any tailor in Dry Creek. His blonde hair gleamed under the lantern light, and his hand rested on Pearl Duval's waist, like she was made of porcelain, and he was the lucky man allowed to touch her. Pearl was radiant in a silk gown imported from New Orleans, the kind of blue that made men look twice and women look away. She didn't glance at Clara. Didn't have to. Her smile, bright and triumphant, was aimed entirely at the world, because she'd won. Clara's stomach twisted. Moments earlier, Beau had taken the stage with the calm confidence of a man who has already decided who he wants to be and who he will sacrifice to get there. When he'd opened his mouth to speak, she'd felt a flutter of hope, stupid and stubborn as a weed that refuses to die. But instead of reaching for her hand, he'd cleared his throat and announced loud enough for every rancher, every schoolteacher, every child in Dry Creek to hear, "I'm proud to call Miss Pearl Duval my future bride." Clara had felt her heart crack, not a clean break, but a splintering like old wood under too much weight. She wasn't surprised that Beau had chosen money. Not really. But she hadn't expected him to make a spectacle of it. He could have told her privately. He could have shown courtesy, dignity, even a scrap of kindness. Instead, he'd looked her straight in the eye as he said Pearl's name, and Clara understood exactly what he intended. He wanted a public ending. He wanted witnesses. He wanted her humiliation to be complete. A cold rush of air slipped under the door as someone stepped outside, and instinct urged Clara to follow. But her boots rooted to the floor. Her breath stung in her chest. The hall spun around her, and she clung to the chair once more, forcing herself to breathe. In. Out. Don't fall. Her vision sharpened just enough to notice Miss Lottie Ray watching her from across the room. The older woman's brow furrowed her hands, twisting the green satin ribbon she used to tie her sewing scissors. Clara attempted a small smile, but it came out something broken and pale. She turned toward the exit at last, toward the cool night air that promised relief, but her way was blocked by Pastor Miller carrying a tray of ginger cakes. "Clara May. You all right, child?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Someone laughed behind her. Not cruelly, just joyfully, someone's good time continuing as hers ended. But the sound cut her open all the same. Pastor Miller's expression shifted, softening into something painfully kind. "You go on home. Ain't no shame in needing air." Shame wasn't the problem. Staying was. Clara nodded and forced her legs to move. She walked past the punch table, the one where she and Beau had shared smiles last summer, and past the girls whispering behind their fans, and past the music that no longer felt like music at all. When she reached the door, she risked one last glance back. Bo didn't notice her. Pearl was laughing at something he said, her manicured hand gripping his arm as if she'd already claimed him body and soul. The hall glowed warm around them like the hearth of a house Clara had just been thrown out of. She stepped into the night. The cold air hit her lungs so sharply, she folded forward, hands braced on her knees, fighting the urge to sob. Stars glittered above the pitch-dark prairie, sharp as needles. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance. Dry Creek at night was usually peaceful. Tonight, even the quiet sounded cruel. Clara straightened slowly. She didn't cry as she made her way down the wooden steps, or when the dry dirt crunched under her boots. She didn't cry when the wind lifted her hair, or when it shoved the hem of her dress against her legs. Her father was waiting at the gate. His lantern held high, his face shadowed with worry. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He just opened the gate, letting her walk through. She did cry then, but not loudly, not messily. Just one tear, hot and fast, sliding down her cheek before she wiped it away with the heel of her palm. She wouldn't be the town fool. She wouldn't let Bo have that satisfaction. As her father bolted the homestead door behind them, she whispered the truth she'd realized in the hall. I died that night, right there between the fiddles and the punch bowl. Not a death of body, a death of believing promises spoken in low light. She hung her shawl, nodded to her father, and went to her room without another word. She lay awake long after the lanterns were blown out, staring at the knot in the wooden ceiling that looked like an eye staring back. Outside, the wind howled a lonely sound, rising and falling across the barren stretch of land. It carried dust, old secrets, and something else she couldn't name. But it also carried the first thin thread of what would come next. 2 years from now, on a Sunday morning, she couldn't yet imagine a man named Silas Boone McAllister would step into the same church where she'd once prayed to be loved. And the way he looked at her would change everything. Clara May Callahan stood in the golden morning light of her father's porch, a tin bucket of well water in one hand and the edge of her apron twisted tightly in the other. The dry wind of late summer rolled down from the buttes beyond Dry Creek, sweeping dust across the old fence line, bending prairie grass in low whispers. 2 years had passed since the spring ball, the night she'd buried her heart alive in a room full of music, and yet some mornings like this one the memory rose uninvited. She still remembered the sting in her chest when Bo Whitaker made his announcement. She remembered the press of judgmental eyes, the heat rising from the back of her neck. The taste of regret swallowed whole. But she also remembered walking out of that hall. Upright, silent, proud. That was something. She poured the water into the basin and rolled up her sleeves. Her hands were sun-browned and calloused, now shaped by mornings like this, feeding chickens, patching fences, and helping her father manage the small dryland plot they called theirs. No one called her delicate anymore, and she didn't miss the word. Inside, the air held the scent of frying potatoes and dust-worn linoleum. Her father sat at the table, boots already on, thumbing through the latest issue of the Wyoming Stockman. He didn't say much these days, but he never had. A good man. Solid. Grieving the death of her mother in quiet ways, keeping her rocking chair untouched, folding Clara's napkin, the same way his wife used to fold hers. Clara pulled the curtain back just enough to look out toward Main Street. Even from the rise where their house sat, she could see the movement horses, tied outside the mercantile wagons full of seed and tools, men in brimmed hats talking with tight-lipped seriousness. But it wasn't them that held her gaze. It was the man stepping down from a black gelding in front of the land office, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark riding clothes with dust on the hem. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but there was something in the way he moved, unhurried, economical, that made her pause. "He's back," her father muttered, not looking up from the paper. Who? Clara asked. McAllister. The name dropped like a stone in a still pond. Silas Boone McAllister, owner of Twin Ridge Ranch, a man whose cattle roamed across 5 counties, whose money funded the schoolhouse roof, whose name made other men, Beau included, stand a little straighter. "What's he doing in town?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Business, I reckon." Her father folded the paper. "Or maybe he's just watching." She raised an eyebrow. "Watching what?" Her father shrugged. "Folks. The land. You." Clara's cheeks flushed. "That's nonsense." He didn't answer, just stood slowly and reached for his hat. "If you go into town today, mind yourself. People look harder at women who walk taller." She knew what he meant. Ever since the spring ball, Clara had walked alone, and alone women drew interest. Some of it polite, some of it not. After chores, Clara dressed in a faded blue skirt and a crisp white blouse with sleeves rolled to the elbow. She pinned her hair back and rode the mare they called Penny into town, a basket of eggs bouncing gently at her chin. It wasn't vanity that made her check her reflection in the bakery's window. It was preparation. The first person she saw was Lottie Ray. The older woman was standing on a crate outside her shop, adjusting the window display, a pale green dress with hand-stitched lace that would have been a marvel in Boston. "You come to buy it or just stare at it, like the rest of us poor girls," Lottie called, grinning. Clara smiled as she dismounted. "I came to bring you eggs." "I'd rather a bottle of whiskey," Lottie said, hopping down and wiping her hands on her apron. "But I guess breakfast comes first." They walked inside together. The dress shop smelled of lavender and wood polish. Clara set the eggs on the counter. "You hear he's back?" Lottie asked casually. "I heard. You seen him?" Clara hesitated. "Not up close." "Well," Lottie said, leaning in like she was about to tell a ghost story, "he was in here last month. Said he needed a gift for his sister in Helena. Didn't even blink when I told him the price. Just pointed to the best shawl I had and paid cash. That's a man who knows value." Clara didn't answer. Lottie leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you afraid of, Clara?" "I'm not afraid," Clara said too quickly. Lottie chuckled. "You're afraid of needing something again." Clara looked away. "Some wounds scab over. Others learn how to breathe." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Lottie went still for a beat, then nodded. "That's the truest thing I've heard all year," she said softly. "But honey, don't confuse healing with hiding." Before Clara could reply, the shop bell rang. They both turned. And there he was. Silas Boone McAllister stood in the doorway like the desert wind had carried him in. Tall, quiet, and unmistakably present. He removed his hat, slowly, respectfully. His eyes, gray as rain on stone, moved to Clara and paused. "Miss Callahan," he said with a nod. "Mr. Vaughan." "McAllister," she replied, voice steady. "I was told you sell eggs." "I do. I'd like a dozen, if you've any left." She handed them over carefully, meeting his gaze for just a moment longer than polite. Something about the way he looked at her, not greedy, not curious, made her chest tighten. Lottie watched with shameless interest. Silas paid in coin, then said almost as an afterthought, "I'll be riding out to the homestead this week, to speak with your father." About what his eyes never left hers. "You." The bell rang again as he left. Lottie exhaled dramatically. "Well, if that don't beat all." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her heart thudded so loud she feared it might echo off the walls. Outside, the town spun on as usual. But for Clara May Callahan, something had shifted, and she wasn't sure if it was hope or trouble. The next morning, her father stood waiting by the gate. "He's coming today," he said simply. Clara gripped the fence post to steady herself. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Because whatever Silas McAllister had to say, she'd listen, even if it turned her whole world upside down. The knock on the door came sharp and clean just before noon. Clara had just finished slicing apples for the pie her father liked with his supper. The knife paused mid-air. She glanced at the flour on her apron, at her hands, at the old wall clock ticking louder than it had all morning. Her father didn't rise. He simply said, "That'll be him." Clara opened the door with more control than she felt. Silas Boone McAllister stood tall in the frame, boots' dusted collar open slightly at the throat, his hat held respectfully in one hand. His presence filled the doorway like thunderclouds gathering over a dry plain, calm still but heavy with something that might split the sky. "Afternoon, Miss Callahan." "Mr. McAllister," she answered, stepping back. He nodded at her father. "Thank you for having me." The old man just gestured toward the table. "Reckon you didn't ride all this way to talk about weather." "No, sir." "I didn't." They sat. Silas removed his gloves, folded them slow and precise the way a man folds thoughts before speaking. Clara stood at the stove pretending to busy herself with the kettle, though her eyes kept drifting back. Finally he spoke. "I'll be direct. I believe in getting to the heart of a thing without painting it up pretty." Her father gave a grunt that might have been approval. Silas turned his gaze to Clara, and for once she didn't look away. "I'm not offering courtship, Miss Callahan. I'm offering terms." The air changed. The kettle didn't whistle, though it felt like it should have. "I own Twin Ridge Ranch," he continued, voice even. "I have 63 working hands, over 2,000 head of cattle, and land from here to the edge of Black Elk Creek. What I don't have is a wife, and I need one." Clara blinked slow. "That's quite the sales pitch, Mr. McAllister." "I'm not selling," he said. "I'm proposing a contract. Mutual respect, shared responsibilities, a life of structure, not passion, not romance, but security and steadiness." Her father leaned forward. "And you thought of my daughter." "I did." Why Silas shifted in his seat, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. "Because she has dignity," he said. "Because she doesn't run her mouth like a child. Because I've watched her work. Because she held her head up when she could have crawled away. I don't want a girl. I want a partner." The words hit Clara harder than any flowery love poem ever could. Because they were true. Because they were rare. But still, "You hardly know me." "I know enough. I've asked around." Quietly. "Nobody's perfect, Miss Callahan. But character leaves footprints. Yours are solid." She crossed her arms, a shield she didn't mean to build. "What do you expect of this wife honesty? Management of the house, kindness to the staff, discretion in public, strength in private. I don't cheat. I don't lie. I don't expect love. And children, if they come, I'll provide. If they don't, I won't stray." It wasn't poetry, but it was powerfully clear. Her father looked at her, really looked, as if checking whether she was a woman who needed soft words or a woman who needed something harder. Clara met Silas's eyes again. "You want an answer today?" "No," he said. "I don't believe in cornering people. Take 3 days. I'll return on Sunday." She nodded slowly. As Silas stood, she followed him to the porch. He paused at the top step, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. You probably dreamed of something different. She tilted her head. Not really. I used to think I did. Then I grew up. His mouth pulled into something close to a smile. Good. I don't want a girl who reads too many storybooks. She watched as he mounted his horse and rode off, dust lifting behind him, like the ghost of a past neither of them spoke of. That night, she stood barefoot under the stars, the chill seeping into her bones in the best kind of way. The moon was sharp and white, and her breath came out in soft clouds. Her mind whirled with thoughts that didn't line up neatly. He didn't offer love. He didn't even ask if she liked him. But he'd seen her. Really seen her. And not the version that had been laughed at 2 years ago. Not the discarded girl in hand-me-down lace. The woman. She wrapped her shawl tighter. Lottie Ray would call her mad for even considering it. Most women would. But most women didn't wake up alone year after year knowing full well the only thing worse than a cold bed was a house full of fake affection. 3 days, he'd said. That left her 2 nights to decide if she was marrying a stranger for the sake of freedom or marrying her freedom to a stranger. The next morning, she rode out early to the riverbanks, letting Penny drink while she stared at the slow-moving water. The wind stirred the cottonwoods, their branches scratching the sky like restless hands. She remembered Beau's voice, the clean, cruel certainty of it, and wondered if she'd ever stop hearing it. Hank Red Elk rode up beside her without a sound. His bay gelding barely made a noise through the brush. He nodded once, not bothering with hello. You know he ain't a man of many words, Hank said after a moment. But when he speaks, he means every syllable. Clara looked at him. You think I should do it? I think, he said, adjusting the reins. You're the first woman I've seen him look at like she's land he'd give up grazing rights for. She let out a breath. That's not a very romantic metaphor. Nothing about Silas is romantic, Hank said. That's why it matters. They sat in silence a while longer. When she rode home that evening, the decision was heavy in her bones, but light in her chest. She felt the weight of it, sure, but not fear. That night, she wrote a short note in her cleanest penmanship, yes, I'll marry you. She folded it, sealed it, and left it with the boy who ran errands between ranches. 3 days later, when Silas Boone McAllister returned, he didn't come to make another speech. He came to set a date. And Clara May Callahan didn't feel like she was losing anything. She felt like she was walking into something she'd built herself. The day after Clara sent the note, it rained. Not hard. Just a soft, steady curtain of drizzle that turned the dirt path into mud and made the porch wood smell like old pine and stories left unfinished. Clara sat under the awning with a cup of coffee wrapped in her hands, eyes on the horizon, as the clouds hung low over the buttes, like they didn't want to leave. 3 days from now, she'd be a married woman. She still wasn't sure if that truth sat sweet in her chest or bitter in her gut. It didn't feel like either, not exactly. More like something deep still and bracing. Like stepping into a river you'd been watching from the bank your whole life. Miss Lottie Ray arrived that afternoon in a yellow slicker boots splattered with mud hair tied up in a knot that looked like it hadn't been fussed with in days. She didn't knock, just opened the door and called out, I brought bread and the last bit of good sense in this town. Where's the bride-to-be? Clara stood from the table. Kitchen. Lottie squinted. You don't look like a woman ready to be claimed by a cattle king. Clara didn't smile. I'm not being claimed. I agreed. That's different. Lottie dropped the bread on the counter and took a long, assessing look at her. So it's real, Clara nodded once. It is. Lottie leaned back against the table and crossed her arms. And you're not scared, Clara stirred the pot of beans on the stove. I've been scared before. This ain't that. Lottie was quiet for a moment. Then, you know, folks are gonna talk. They already do. Well, now they'll talk louder. I can take it. Lottie tilted her head. Why him? Clara set the spoon down and turned. Because he looked me in the eye and didn't pity me. Because he didn't flirt or flatter or promise me things he couldn't give. Because he told the truth. And because it's safer than being alone, Clara's voice didn't shake. If I say yes, it's not because I'm desperate. It's because I'm done waiting for men who lie pretty. Lottie stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow and solemn, as if accepting terms of a contract. Then I'll make your dress. Clara blinked. I didn't ask, no you didn't. Lottie said, already pulling swatches from her satchel. But I've waited years to sew a dress for a woman who knows her own worth. You're getting lace whether you like it or not. That night, Clara found her father sitting on the porch, sharpening a rusted old knife that hadn't been used since her mother's funeral. He didn't look up when she joined him. You sure? He asked after a while. I am. You think he'll be good to you? Clara thought of Silas's eyes, clear, steady, not warm, but not unkind. Like he saw her without reaching for more. I think he'll respect me, she said. That's more than most women get. Her father nodded. He came by. Told me he's having a room made ready for you at the ranch. Wants you to feel like it's your home from the start. Clara swallowed. That was thoughtful. He also said he won't touch you unless you invite it. Her cheeks flushed. Pa, I'm just telling you what he said. Man don't need to say things like that. But he did. That matters. The next morning, Clara rode out toward the bluffs, needing space, needing quiet. The land was soaked and green, and the wind carried the smell of wet sage and promises not yet broken. She dismounted near the bend in the river and sat beneath a cottonwood that had split during last year's storm. Hank Red Elk found her there, same as before. He didn't speak at first, just tied his horse and sat nearby. Finally, he said, Silas tells me he ain't had a proper dinner at his own table in over 5 years. Why not? Clara asked. Too many ghosts, Hank said. His wife died slow. He never talked about her, not even to the hands. Just buried her and kept working. Clara brushed a leaf off her skirt. I'm not her. No, Hank said. But maybe you'll teach him there's more to life than land and fences. She didn't answer, but her fingers dug into the damp earth beside her like she needed to feel something solid. The wedding came fast. The morning of the sky turned blue like it had been holding its breath all week. Lottie arrived before dawn, dress packed in a white cotton sheet like something holy. They got ready in silence. Clara wore her hair in a low twist, pinned with her mother's combs. Her dress was simple cream muslin lace at the sleeves, buttons down the back like tiny pearls. No veil, no flowers, just her. When she stepped outside, Silas was already there. He didn't blink, didn't smile wide, just gave a small nod like she'd met him at the exact place and time he'd always expected. The preacher waited at the chapel near the edge of town, a wooden structure so weather-beaten it leaned slightly to one side. Only a handful of people attended: her father, Lottie, Hank, 2 ranch hands, and a young Shoshone girl who tended Silas's cook fires. No music, no rice, just vows. I take you as you are, Silas said, voice low but clear, without false hope or hollow words. Clara looked him dead in the eye. And I take you knowing the truth is worth more than the dream. They signed the paper, shook hands. And that was that. When they rode back toward Twin Ridge, the sun hung low and bright, casting long shadows that looked like giants trailing behind them. Clara sat tall in the saddle. Silas kept pace beside her. They didn't speak, but when they reached the front porch of the big stone house nestled between the hills, he helped her down and handed her the keys without fanfare. "All yours now," he said. She paused at the threshold, then stepped inside. They arrived at Twin Ridge just as the sun dropped behind the hills, casting long, copper shadows across the valley. The wind had gone still, like even the land was holding its breath. Clara dismounted slow, careful, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that crossing this threshold wasn't just walking into a house. It was walking into a life. Silas held the reins in silence as she climbed the wide stone steps to the front door. She turned back the weight of the moment, pressing down on her spine, and he handed her a ring of keys, brass worn heavy in the palm. "You'll want to change the locks at some point," he said simply. "I've never done it." "Should've." Clara nodded. "I will." He gave a small nod, then led the horses toward the barn boots crunching over gravel like slow thunder. She pushed the door open. The air inside smelled like oiled wood, cold stone, and faintly of tobacco. It was tidy, almost obsessively so. A large fireplace dominated the far wall. The furniture was practical, clean lines, thick fabric, nothing soft for softness's sake. The kind of place a man lived because he needed shelter, not comfort. Clara stepped in, fully listening to the echo of her own breath. In the entryway, a table held a row of ledgers, 3 stacked books, and a tin box of polished bullets. Above them, a framed map of Wyoming hung at a slight angle. Not a single family photo. She walked through the parlor, fingers brushing over the back of the armchair, then past the dining table where placemats were still crisp like they'd never been used. The kitchen was spotless, every pan hung with precision. The stove was newer than expected. Someone had tried to make this house work, but not for long. Upstairs, there were 3 rooms. 2 were guest quarters, neat and unused. The third was hers. She knew because it had a fresh pitcher of water, a folded nightgown, and a handwritten note on the vanity in plain square handwriting. "Room is yours. Change what you like. Doors never locked. S." There was no mention of the bedroom across the hall. No invitation. No expectation. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the quilt, patched with dark blues and rust reds. Not store-bought. Hand-sewn. Old. It grounded her. Outside, a distant knock came from the barn doors. Horses being settled, boots in hay, life moving on. She whispered to no one in particular. They said it was the driest spring in 10 years. Guess it was time something bloomed. The next few days unfolded like a trial run of an unwritten contract. Silas rose before dawn, worked before breakfast, and returned late with dust on his shoulders and questions in his eyes he never asked aloud. Clara made coffee, kept her silence, and started learning the bones of the house, where the floor creaked, which windows stuck, what doors never quite shut. He didn't hover. He didn't demand. He gave her space like a man who'd had his taken away once and learned never to steal it from someone else again. On the 3rd morning, she walked into the study and placed 2 slices of warm cornbread on his desk without a word. He looked up from a land survey, said a quiet thank you, and that was all. Later, she began reorganizing the pantry, sorting supplies, writing inventory in her own handwriting. She found a box of dried lavender in the cellar, long forgotten, and tied sprigs to the window frames to clear the scent of dust and memory. The ranch hands were another matter. Most kept their distance. Some were polite. A few were skeptical. Only Hank Red Elk greeted her with a nod like they were already on the same page of a book no one else had bothered reading. One afternoon, Clara brought a basket of sandwiches out to the corral. Hank leaned against the fence watching a young colt buck like it had something to prove. "You runnin' the house now?" he asked. "Someone's gotta," she replied. He nodded. "It's a good house. Been empty too long." She glanced over at the barn where Silas stood talking to two ranch hands. "He lets people in more than they think," Hank said. "He just don't know how to say it." Clara didn't answer, but she stayed beside him a while longer watching the colt tire itself out. That night, she opened the ledger cabinet and began sorting through the household books. The entries were neat, but dated. The last page had been filled out 6 months ago. Clara dipped her pen in ink and wrote a new header, July, House Accounts Managed by C.M.M. McAllister. Her hand paused for just a second before writing the initials, then kept going. On the 6th day, Silas came in later than usual. Rain slicked his hat, and his shirt was wet through. Clara was at the stove stirring stew sleeves rolled to her elbows. She turned to face him. "You're soaked." Storm rolled in fast. Fence near Black Rock came down. She grabbed a towel and tossed it to him. "You need dry clothes. You'll catch cold." He caught the towel one-handed but didn't move. The hands were talking today. "About me." "About the house," he said. "Said it smells like something new, like someone lives here again." Clara stirred the stew without looking at him. "That a problem? No." She poured him a bowl, set it on the table, then sat across from him. He didn't touch the spoon at first, just watched her. "I've had this place for years," he said, "but it never felt finished. And now..." He finally picked up the spoon. "Now it's got walls that remember voices." She looked down at her bowl. "That a compliment?" she asked softly. He didn't smile, but he looked at her longer than necessary. "It's the closest I know how to give." Later, when she went to bed, she found a small square parcel on the pillow, a folded handkerchief with her initials embroidered on the corner. Not a gift, not a gesture, just a sign, a quiet one. He was trying. And in that stillness in that room she now called hers, Clara realized something she hadn't dared believe. She was building a life that didn't ask her to shrink. The invitation arrived folded inside a crisp ivory envelope, pressed with the seal of the Dry Creek Social Committee. Clara found it waiting on the porch, tucked beneath a jar of blackberry preserves someone had left anonymously, maybe Lottie, maybe not. She opened the envelope slowly, fingers stiff, knowing full well what it would say before her eyes even touched the words. "You are cordially invited to the Dry Creek Summer Jubilee Ball, in celebration of good harvests, clean hearts, and second chances." Second chances. The phrase hit her like a match to dry brush. She sat on the porch steps, the paper resting in her lap, her breath barely moving. The same town, the same hall, the same wooden floorboards that had once splintered beneath the weight of her shame. Except this time she would walk in married. Not a scandal. Not the girl left standing by the punch table with a hollow chest and pride bruised beyond repair. This time she would walk in on her own terms. But still her fingers curled into fists. Inside, she handed the invitation to Silas without a word. He read it, then looked up. "You want to go?" Clara shrugged. "Doesn't much matter if I want to. We've been invited. I don't go to dances." "I figured." A silence stretched between them. Not harsh, just wide, like a field waiting to be crossed. "If you want to go," Silas said at last, "I'll stand beside you." Clara studied his face. It wasn't a promise of enjoyment or even comfort, just presence. that she could live with. "All right," she said. "Then we go." Lottie Ray arrived the next morning with fabric samples and fire in her voice. She'd known the invitation would come. Knew Clara would say yes, whether she admitted it or not. "You don't get to rewrite the past, honey," she said, pulling out deep emerald satin, "but you do get to slap a fresh coat of dignity over it." Clara let her. The dress was simple, elegant, sleeveless, but high-necked with a fitted waist and a skirt that whispered instead of shouted. It didn't beg for attention. It commanded it by refusing to try. "You're not there to impress, Lottie," said eyes narrowed in approval. "You're there to remind 'em what survival looks like with a backbone." The night of the ball, Silas waited for hers, at the foot of the staircase, boots, polished shirt, tucked hat in hand. He didn't speak when she appeared, just looked. She felt it, that look. Not hunger, not awe, just quiet recognition. As if seeing her in that green dress confirmed something he'd already known. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day I walked out of that place." They rode into town side by side. The lights of the hall shimmered ahead, strings of lanterns swaying in the warm wind. Fiddle music drifted across the prairie like laughter too far away to understand. Clara stepped inside first. The room fell quiet, not entirely, but enough to notice. Heads turned, fans slowed, men straightened, women blinked. She didn't flinch. Her boots clicked against the floor like punctuation marks. She nodded to familiar faces, with measured grace, her hand resting lightly on Silas's arm. He didn't guide her, didn't shield her, just walked beside her like she belonged. And maybe for the first time she did. She spotted Pearl Duval across the room, resplendent in white lace, her blonde curls pinned with pearls. Bo Whitaker wasn't far behind, dressed sharp, mouth set tight as he saw Clara. She gave him nothing. Not a smile, not a nod, not a single scrap of reaction. Pearl approached her smile thin. "Mrs. McAllister." "What a surprise." Clara kept her tone level. "Isn't that the nature of surprises?" Pearl's gaze flicked toward Silas, who stood a step behind, impassive. "I heard you married quick." "I married when I was ready." Pearl's lips twitched. "Well, I hope the dust suits you. I hear Twin Ridge is more work than reward." Clara smiled, then not wide, not fake. "Just enough. It's not work if you don't expect someone else to carry the load." She walked away without waiting for a response. Silas raised an eyebrow as they reached the edge of the dance floor. "That go how you expected, better," Clara said, exhaling. "I thought I'd burn when I saw them, but all I felt was nothing." The music shifted slower now, something with a waltz tempo. He hesitated. "I don't dance, I don't either," she said. "Not with liars, but I'll try with you." He held out a hand. She placed hers in it. Their steps were clumsy at first. He counted under his breath. She bit back a grin. Then something loosened, shoulders, chins, breath. They moved not gracefully, but steadily. She leaned in slightly. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What's that? You can't haunt the same place you survived." It came out low, close to his ear. He stilled for half a beat. "That a quote?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's the truth." They left the ball an hour later. No goodbyes, no announcements. Just the sound of gravel under boots and the rustle of cloth in the wind. On the ride back, Clara let her hair fall loose behind her, the pins tucked in her palm. She looked up at the stars, their cold brightness steady overhead. "Feel lighter?" Silas asked beside her. She thought for a moment. "No, not lighter, just clearer." He nodded. said nothing more. When they arrived home, she didn't go straight to her room. Instead, she stepped into the kitchen, lit a lamp, and began boiling water for tea. Silas removed his coat and leaned against the counter. "You were good tonight," she said. "I was just still. That's what made it good." A pause settled between them. Then she said it, the thing she hadn't dared in 2 years, you know. "That night Beau left me standing there, I swore I'd never come back to that place." Silas nodded. "So why'd you—" She looked up at him, eyes steady. "To prove I wasn't built from what broke me." He didn't smile, but his hand moved to the kettle, steady and sure, as if to say he understood. In the distance, coyotes cried out. The prairie, vast and unforgiving, stretched beyond their window. But inside the house held warmth, and Clara, for the first time, didn't feel like she had something to prove. The fire started just after midnight. Clara woke first, her eyes snapping open to the scent of smoke, not thick yet, but present like something smoldering just beneath the surface of the night. She sat up fast, heart already racing, instincts kicking in before thought. Twin Ridge didn't run dry like most ranches, but in summer a blaze could tear through the valley in hours. She grabbed her robe and rushed down the stairs, barefoot, feet silent on the wood. Silas was already on the porch, shirt half-buttoned, boots half-laced, eyes fixed on the ridgeline to the west. Orange light flickered on the far hills, far enough not to reach them yet, but close enough to mean trouble. Clara joined him, breath-catching, as she saw it herself, the glowing edge of fire crawling down the slope, low and fast. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "If the wind shifts east, we've got hours. If it shifts north, we've got less." She didn't wait. She turned on her heel and started back inside. "Then we don't stand here watching." By the time she returned, she'd pulled on her boots, grabbed 2 pails, and slung her shawl over her shoulders. "Where do you need me?" she asked. Silas looked at her for a half-second longer than usual. No hesitation. Just something that might have been gratitude buried in his eyes. He handed her the barn key. "Get the foals out first. They spook easy. Move them east toward the stream. Hank and the others are already heading there." She nodded and ran. By the time she reached the stables, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and heat. The horses snorted and stomped nervously. Clara spoke to them low and steady, the way her father taught her, her hands firm but gentle, as she led each one out into the dark. The foals came first, then the mares. She tied them in pairs and walked them down the path toward the stream bed, where it was damp and cool. The sky glowed above the trees now, like dawn had arrived, angry and early. At the ridge, Silas and the ranch hands dug fire breaks, swinging axes and shovels with desperate rhythm. Hank barked orders. Men passed buckets in a chain. Sweat ran down their faces like rain that never fell. By dawn, Clara had moved every horse and calf out of danger. Her dress was soaked through with effort. Her arms ached, her throat burned. But when she returned to the house, smoke rising behind her like a curtain, Silas was still standing, covered in ash, breathing hard, but still standing. "You stayed on the line all night," she said. "So did you." He didn't smile, but he did look at her with something raw, something stripped of all the silence they usually lived inside. "I didn't marry you for this," she said softly, her voice cracking. "But I think this is when I became your wife." He didn't reply. But he didn't need to. Later that afternoon, with the fire mostly beaten and the worst behind them, Clara sat on the back porch, her hands stained black from soot and ash, a wet cloth draped across her neck. The land smelled scorched and bitter. Black lines cut across the far hill like scars. Silas came out, and dropped beside her with a grunt. His sleeve was torn, his forearm scratched and red. Clara handed him the water jug. He drank deep, then leaned back with a sigh. "They'll ask how much we lost," he said. "They always do." He turned his head toward her. "But I don't care about the fences or the tools. I care about what stayed." She watched a hawk drift overhead in the smoky sky, wings wide and steady. "Sometimes fire don't destroy," she murmured. "Sometimes it clears the weeds." Silas nodded once. "Sometimes a good burn saves the land." They sat there for a long while, neither speaking. That evening, Lottie arrived with biscuits and gauze and a mouthful of curses about men too stubborn to know when they're bleeding. She cleaned Silas's arm and fussed over Clara's bruised knuckles. But even she went quiet when she saw the look between them. Not love, not yet, but something solid. That night, Clara didn't go to her room. She walked to the study where Silas sat reading the crop reports by lamplight. She didn't ask permission, just walked in and stood by the desk until he looked up. "I ain't looking for comfort," she said. His jaw tightened. "All right. I'm not here because I'm scared." "Okay. I'm here because we built something last night." He set the papers down slow. "We did. And I'd rather not sleep alone in a house we just saved together." He stood then, slow and careful, like the moment might break if he moved too fast. "You sure?" she nodded. "I'm tired of waiting for soft words. I just want truth and a place to land." Silas stepped around the desk and took her hand, not tight, not urgent, just enough. They went upstairs, not speaking, and he opened the door to the room across from hers. It wasn't much, just a bed, a dresser, and a window cracked open to let the night in. He pulled back the covers. She climbed in first. And when he lay beside her, they didn't touch. Not yet. But they breathed the same air, and that was more than either of them had shared with anyone in a long time. The past didn't knock when it showed up. It rode in bold, trailing dust and swagger like it owned the ground it stood on. Clara saw it first from the kitchen window, the silhouette of a rider easing through the ranch gate posture, too confident, hat tipped just so, the kind of entrance that didn't ask permission because it never needed to. She felt it before she recognized the horse, before the sharp edge of memory cut through the breath in her lungs. Bo Whitaker. The man who'd once offered her a future with a silver tongue and a coward's spine. Her hand tightened on the dish towel. The air in the room thickened. She didn't move until she heard the hoofbeats fade into silence, followed by the hollow knock of boots on wood. She didn't open the door. Silas did. Clara stood behind him, just out of sight, heart steady, voice silent. Bo's voice rang out all the same. "Heard you had a fire. Thought I'd pay my respects. Might have lost some fence line myself." "Appreciate it," Silas replied, voice calm, unreadable. "But we've got it handled." Bo chuckled. That same smug lilt Clara remembered too well. "Never figured you for a marrying man, McAllister. Especially not to a woman with that kind of history." Clara stepped forward then. Silas didn't stop her. She opened the door wide, meeting Bo's smirk with a stare so level it near split him in two. "What kind of history is that, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. He blinked, caught off guard. "Didn't mean anything by it, Clara." "No," she said, voice like ice cracking across a lake. "You never did." He looked past her at Silas. "You sure she's the right fit? Twin Ridge is a big place. You need someone solid." Silas didn't blink. "She is solid. More than most men I know." Bo shifted, cleared his throat. "Well, I didn't come to stir up dust. Just offering help if you need it." We don't, Clara said. Beau opened his mouth again, then closed it. The door shut in his face a second later, not slammed, not angry. Just done. She stood there for a long moment staring at the door. Silas spoke gently. You all right? Fine, she said, but her knuckles were white against her sides. He didn't push. That night, the quiet in the house held weight. Clara sat on the porch watching the stars flicker behind the leftover smoke haze. The wind was slow cool, calming if she let it be. Silas came out eventually, handing her a mug of coffee. Beau won't be back, he said. Clara sipped the coffee without looking at him. He will. People like him don't show up unless they want something. What do you think he wants? She turned to face him, eyes calm and tired. He wants to be the man he couldn't be when it counted. He wants to rewrite the story. Silas nodded slowly. But it ain't his to write anymore. No, she agreed. It's mine. She stood up then barefoot on the porch wood. And I'm not letting him take one more chapter. The next morning she found a letter left on the fence post near the barn. Her name scrawled in ink that had smudged in the night dew. She opened it with steady hands. Clara, I never stopped thinking about you. You know that. I messed up. I was young and stupid, but you were always meant to be mine. I see it now. And maybe you do too. Let me take you for a ride. Just one ride, for old time's sake. Beau. She folded it, walked it straight to the fire pit behind the barn, and dropped it into the coals, watched it curl and blacken and vanish. She didn't tell Silas. Not because she was hiding anything, but because it wasn't worth mentioning. Not anymore. Later that week, Silas brought her a package new leather gloves, smaller than the standard ones he gave the hands. Figured you needed your own, he said simply. She smiled, tucking her fingers into the soft interior. They fit. He tipped his hat. Course they do. You've always belonged out here. Something about that hit her deeper than it should have. She wasn't used to belonging. Not really. At supper, Hank Red Elk leaned in over his stew. You think Whitaker's done sniffing around? Clara didn't hesitate. Doesn't matter if he is. I'm not. Hank chuckled. You're tougher than most men I know. She gave him a look. That's supposed to be a compliment. He tipped his hat toward her. It's supposed to be the truth. Later that night, Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while Silas read beside her lantern light, soft across his brow. She turned toward him. He said I was always meant to be his. Silas didn't flinch, just set the book down and looked at her. And do you believe that? She shook her head. I don't believe I'm meant to be anyone's. I choose where I go. His voice was low, steady. Then I'm glad you chose here. She swallowed. Me too. She slid her hand across the bed, her fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. The past had come riding in proud and bold. But she hadn't buckled. She had stood firm, hands steady, heart sure. And in that quiet moment with Silas beside her and the firelight flickering low, Clara knew something deeper than peace. She knew power, the kind you don't take, the kind you earn. The storm didn't come from the sky. It came from inside, slow at first, creeping under Clara's skin, like a fever she didn't want to name. It showed up in the way her voice caught mid-sentence and how her hands paused longer than usual over the flour tin, in the way her eyes drifted toward the hills with a hunger she couldn't explain. She didn't sleep much. She'd lay beside Silas, body still, thoughts racing like wild horses through dry grass. There was no single thought that kept her up. It was all of them. The weight of the ranch, the eyes of the town, Beau's reappearance, the long echo of who she used to be, and the terrifying truth of how much she'd begun to care. That was the hardest part. Because caring meant risk. Caring meant exposure. Caring meant she couldn't just leave if things cracked. One morning, Silas found her in the barn before dawn, running a brush down one of the mares with a sharpness that didn't match the calm rhythm of the task. He didn't speak at first, just leaned on the stall door, arms crossed. "You trying to outwork the sun?" he asked. Clara didn't look up, just restless. Silas studied her for a beat. "You ever think maybe it's okay not to carry everything?" "I don't carry everything." He didn't say anything. Didn't have to. She stopped brushing, let her hands drop to her sides. The air was thick with the scent of hay and old sweat and something heavier. "I feel like I'm waiting for something to go wrong," she said finally. "Like if I let this be good even for a second, it'll all fall apart." Silas stepped forward. "You think I don't know that feeling?" She turned to him. "Maybe you do, but you've had years to build your walls. I'm just now figuring out what mine are made of." Silas nodded slowly. "Sometimes the walls don't keep things out. Sometimes they just keep us in." That afternoon, clouds rolled in from the north. Not rain, not yet, but the kind that pressed the air down heavy on your chest. Clara worked through it anyway. She scrubbed the floors, rearranged the pantry, refolded every towel in the house like precision might hold back the mess inside her. Lottie showed up unannounced, as she often did. One look at Clara's flushed cheeks and tight jaw, and she whistled low. "You look like a woman 2 minutes from setting something on fire." Clara dropped a spoon into the drawer. "I'm fine." Fine is the biggest lie we tell ourselves right before we snap. Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I'm tired of fighting ghosts." "You sure it's ghosts?" Lottie asked, voice soft now. "Or is it just yourself that's stuck?" Harder than Clara wanted it to. That evening, Silas found her sitting under the cottonwood tree near the stream, knees pulled to her chest, dress dusted with leaves. She didn't move when he approached. "Lottie said you'd be out here," he said, sitting down beside her. "Guess I'm predictable." "No," he replied, "just honest enough to feel things you don't always speak out loud." She looked at him. "Why'd you marry me?" He turned toward her, the question hitting heavier than the wind. "Because I wanted something that wasn't fake," he said. "Because you looked me in the eye and didn't flinch. And because I thought if there's anyone I'd trust to build a life with, it's her." Clara's throat tightened. "What if I don't know how to let go of what came before?" For she whispered. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then we burn it down together." She let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years. "I've spent so long fighting to be strong," she said. "I forgot strength doesn't always mean silence." He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. His presence was the touch. They sat there, storm and the blood wind rising around them, nothing spoken after that, but everything said. The next day, the rain came hard and sudden, drenching the ranch in 20 minutes flat. Clara stood out in it, letting it soak her hair, her dress, her skin. She tilted her face to the sky and let it wash her clean. Silas found her there, his hat already dripping. "You trying to drown?" he asked. "No," she said, smiling. "I'm trying to come back to life." He smiled, then real soft, rare. The kind that didn't need words. That night, Clara lit a fire in the hearth, real flames licking wood warmth, curling into every corner of the house. She set the table, not fancy, just steady. A meal cooked with care. When Silas sat down, she poured the coffee and looked him in the eye. "I'm done running from what this is. He nodded. Me too. You might not get poetry from me, she said, but you'll get truth. I don't need poetry, he replied. I just need you. The storm had passed. Not just the rain, but the one inside her. And what remained in its place was something steadier than fear, something stronger than pride. A woman no longer haunted, no longer waiting for something to go wrong. She'd let herself feel, and in doing so, she'd finally begun to heal. The morning light poured through the kitchen window like honey thick, golden slow. Clara stood barefoot at the sink, sleeves rolled up, her hands still damp from washing the breakfast dishes. The house smelled like coffee soap and wood smoke. Everything was quiet, still, whole. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to brace herself against the day. There was peace in the air. Not loud, not triumphant. Just earned. Behind her, Silas was mending a saddle strap at the table, his fingers moving steady through worn leather head, bowed like in prayer. The man had a way of being fully present in silence, and Clara had learned to love that about him. She turned, wiped her hands, and leaned against the counter. You think it's possible, she said, for something broken to come back stronger than it was before? Silas looked up, not startled, not puzzled, just patient. You mean us? He asked. I mean anything. He considered it a moment. Fire burns what's weak, but it don't touch what's meant to last. Not really. That part just gets tempered. She smiled. So we're tempered. He nodded. Ashes don't mean the end. Sometimes it's where the gold gets poured. Later that day, they rode out to the northern pasture, where the grass had already begun to push back through the scorched earth. Clara watched the blades bend in the wind, soft green among the blackened dirt. It's strange, she said, how fast things come back. Silas dismounted beside her. Not strange, just natural. They walked the fence line, checking for breaks. The sky stretched wide above them, blue as forgiveness. At one post, Clara paused. This is where the worst of it was, right? He nodded. We thought the fire would jump the ridge. If it had, we'd have lost the barn. She reached down and ran her fingers through the soil. It was warm. Alive. I stood here the night it happened, Silas said. I remember thinking, if this place goes, I won't rebuild it. I'll let it die. Clara looked up at him. But you didn't. No. Because I saw you moving the colts barefoot, hair soaked in sweat, yelling louder than the storm. And I thought, hell, if she's fighting, I can't quit. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and ash and distant rain. They mounted up again and rode toward the southern slope where the apple trees stood untouched by the blaze. Clara reached up and plucked one from the branch, turning it in her hand. Funny, she said. This survived. Some things know how to hold on. She took a bite. It was crisp, sweet, real. That night, Silas found her in the study, leafing through an old book of pressed flowers someone had left behind, maybe his late wife, maybe someone before that. She closed it gently and placed it back on the shelf. House feels different lately, she said. He walked in, leaned against the doorframe. You mean cleaner? She shook her head. No. Warmer. Less like I'm borrowing a place and more like it knows I'm staying. Silas nodded. Because you are. She turned toward him. You sure about that? Never been more. She walked toward him, slow and deliberate. Stopped just inches from his chest. Then it's time I gave something back. That night they didn't speak much. But when she reached for him, he met her halfway, not urgent, not unsure. Just steady, open, grounded, like a man who knew this moment wasn't about passion or conquest. It was about presence. They lay tangled afterward, breath mingling, her head tucked beneath his chin. "You were right," she whispered, "about what ashes ain't the end." The next day, Clara rode into town for supplies. When she walked into the mercantile, people looked. Not with judgment, with something closer to recognition. Like they saw her for what she was, now not the girl Beau left behind, but the woman who'd come through fire and didn't flinch. Pearl Duval gave her a tight-lipped smile. Clara returned it with one twice as calm. At the counter, Lottie rang her up and leaned forward. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one people get when they realize they ain't surviving anymore. They're living." Clara tucked the flour sack into her basket. "Feels strange." Lottie shrugged. Strange is just new wearing its Sunday best. Outside, Clara passed the churchyard. The preacher stood watering the shrubs, pausing to nod politely. A year ago, he wouldn't have made eye contact. Now he tipped his hat. Back at the ranch, she walked through the front door, set down the basket, and paused in the center of the room. Everything smelled like cinnamon and sun-warmed wood. She heard Silas hammering something out back, slow, deliberate strikes. She walked toward the sound, the rhythm of home. When she reached him, he looked up. Fence lines nearly repaired. She smiled. "So are we." He stepped forward, took off his gloves, and reached for her hand. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we should host something. A dinner. Let people see what we've made here." Clara blinked. "You want a crowd, not a crowd. Just community. I think it's time this place opened its doors again." She squeezed his hand. "Then let's do it. Let's show them we're not ghosts." Silas smiled, slow and warm. "No. We're gold in the ashes." And Clara, standing beneath the big Wyoming sky with calloused hands and a heart no longer afraid, knew they had crossed the line between surviving and belonging. It started with a letter. Folded tight, slipped under the front door, while the sky was still pale with morning haze. Clara bent to pick it up, her fingers already tensing. Something in the air changed before her eyes even met the paper. The handwriting was familiar, arrogant, slanted. Beau Whitaker. She didn't read it right away. She held it in her palm as she walked to the kitchen, lit the stove, and started the coffee. The house was still, but inside her the past was stirring again. Not violently this time, just present. Waiting. Silas entered quietly, still pulling on his shirt. He saw the letter in her hand and paused. From him, Clara nodded. "Seems so." "Want me to read it?" "No," she said. "I need to." She opened it slowly, like peeling back old skin. Clara. "You and I both know some things don't fade just because time says they should. I've been thinking maybe we ought to meet. Properly. Just once. I'm leaving Dry Creek for good. I'll be at Dead Man's Bluff at sundown tomorrow. No tricks, just closure. You deserve that. Beau." She read it twice, then a third time, then folded it again and set it down on the table like it weighed 100 pounds. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. "You going?" "I don't know," she said, staring into the steam. "Part of me says no, that it's not worth digging up again. And the other part—" She looked up at him. "The other part says I can't finish this chapter if I don't close the last one." He didn't tell her what to do, didn't press. Just said, "If you go, you don't go alone." "No," she said. "I think I have to." The rest of the day passed in slow silence. Clara worked the garden, kneading her tension into the dirt, planting new onions, trimming back herbs. Silas repaired the back gate, kept busy, but his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. She packed that evening. Not much, just her riding gloves, her shawl, a flask of water. She didn't dress for drama, just wore her working clothes, dusted and familiar. As she saddled her horse, Hank Red Elk rode up from the south trail, his face unreadable. "You riding somewhere, Clara?" "Dead Man's Bluff." He dismounted slowly. That name never meant peace. "I'm not looking for peace," she said. "Just an ending." Hank studied her. "Then make sure it's the kind that doesn't rewrite what you've built." "I intend to." She rode out alone. The land stretched wide and empty around her, the wind tugging her braid loose, the smell of sage and dry soil riding the breeze. Dead Man's Bluff sat high above the valley, a rocky ledge that caught every echo, every wind-whipped whisper. Bo was already there, hat in hand, leaning against a dead tree, like some outlaw from a forgotten dime novel. "You came," he said. Clara dismounted slow and steady. "Say what you need to say." He looked older, still handsome in that polished way, but worn. His charm had faded, and what was left was more desperate than dashing. "I was wrong," he said. "I know. I didn't leave you because I stopped loving you," he added quickly. "I left because I was afraid of what it meant to love you fully. You were always more than I could handle." Clara crossed her arms. "And now," he stepped forward. "Now I know better. Now I see what I gave up. You and me, we were wildfire. Maybe we still are." Clara's voice was low, calm, final. "No bow. We were sparks. That's not the same as fire." He blinked, caught off guard. "You thought love was something to admire. I thought it was something you built. That's why it didn't work." He looked down at the dirt, then back at her. "I thought maybe before I left we could have a moment. Just one. A kiss. Something real." She stepped closer, not to offer anything, but to let him see the truth in her eyes. "This is real," she said. "Me standing here, telling you no. That's the most honest thing I've ever done." He swallowed hard. "So that's it?" "Yes," she said. "This is the last goodbye." She turned to leave, mounted her horse. Bo didn't follow, didn't call out. Because he knew. The ride back was different. The wind didn't feel like it pushed against her anymore. The air didn't taste like the past. She rode faster, not to escape, but because she wanted to get home. Home. Not a house, not a man. A life. Silas was waiting on the porch when she returned. The lantern lit his book untouched in his lap. He stood when she dismounted. "You all right?" "I am," she said. He didn't ask what was said, didn't ask what happened, just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, held her longer than usual until the night fell completely silent. Inside, she placed her gloves by the door, unpinned her braid, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. "I burned the letter," she said. "Before I left." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I already knew the answer," she said. "I just needed to hear it from myself." Later, lying in bed, her body curved into his, she whispered it again. This was the last goodbye. And in the dark, he pressed a kiss to her temple and said only, "Then let's begin something new." The morning after the goodbye felt like a beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The kind of beginning that settles into your bones like a familiar rhythm. Clara woke to the scent of rain in the distance and Silas already moving about downstairs. The ranch was quiet, but not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something earned. She stretched, rolled out of bed, and stood barefoot on the wooden floorboards. The window was cracked open, and a breeze swept through cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. She breathed it in like it was medicine. Downstairs, Silas was frying eggs and toasting bread over the stove. He looked up when she entered, his eyes soft, that quiet strength she'd come to rely on humming under the surface. He didn't say good morning. He just handed her a cup of coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was. They ate together in silence, not out of discomfort, but out of ease. She was no longer filling silence with apologies. He was no longer waiting for her to run. Afterward, she walked out into the yard, boots crunching the gravel, hands tucked in the pockets of her coat. The air was brisk, the sky low and silver with early clouds. A fine mist danced along the tops of the fields. Hank Red Elk was mending the gate, whistling some old tune passed down from generations before. He tipped his hat when he saw her. Morning, Clara. Morning, Hank. Fence holding stronger than before the fire. Woods new. Wires tight. Nothing wrong with starting again if you do it right. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the land beyond the pasture. The place that had burned, healed, and now bloomed with promise again. Inside the barn, she found the newest foal lying in the straw, long legs stretched out, eyes barely open. She knelt beside him, brushed her hand gently along his neck. He stirred but didn't startle. "You made it through," she whispered. "Guess we both did." By mid-afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds and preparations for the gathering began. It wasn't a grand affair, just a quiet supper with neighbors, ranch hands, and folks who'd stuck by them even when tongues in town had wagged. Lottie brought cornbread and wildflower arrangements. Hank roasted a side of venison on the open fire pit. Music played from a battered old phonograph set on the porch railing, the needle scratching out old Western tunes that pulled at something deep and soft in Clara's chest. As guests began arriving, Clara stood back for a moment watching. She saw Lottie laughing with two of the ranch hands' aprons still tied around her waist. She saw Hank showing the Duval twins how to carve whistles from wood. Children chased each other across the dirt yard, and somewhere in the distance someone opened a bottle of cider and whooped like it was Christmas. And then she saw Silas standing near the barn, talking with Sheriff Briggs. The two men shook hands, the kind of handshake that said, "We've weathered storms, and we're still here." Clara walked over, a plate of biscuits in one hand, a folded blanket in the other. "Sheriff," she said, nodding. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. McAllister, looks like you've done all right out here." Clara smiled. "Took a little fire to clear the weeds, but the land's holding strong now. That's all any of us can ask for," he said. As the sky turned gold and shadows lengthened, someone lit the string of lanterns across the porch. Light flickered in warm patterns across the faces of those gathered. Stories were told. Some true, some stretched. Laughter rose. Tears were quietly wiped away in moments too sacred to interrupt. Clara sat beside Silas on the porch steps, a blanket draped over both their shoulders. She leaned into him, and he rested his hand lightly over hers. "You remember the first night I stepped foot on this porch?" she asked. "I do. You looked like you might bolt. I almost did. But you didn't." "No. Something told me to stay." He turned to her. "You think that something still knows what it's doing?" Clara smiled. "I think it might have known better than I ever gave it credit for." They sat there for a while, just breathing. The stars blinked awake above them, and the night wrapped around the ranch like an old friend returned home. At one point, Lottie stood and raised a glass of sweet tea. "I want to say something," she said, voice carrying over the yard. People quieted, turned toward her. "This here," she said, gesturing to the porch. "The house, the people, this is what resilience looks like. It ain't loud. It don't always roar. Sometimes it just shows up every damn day and keeps building." She looked at Clara. "You didn't come back just to prove something. You came back to become something. And you did." A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Clara felt her throat tighten. Not from pain. From knowing. After the guests had gone and the lanterns were extinguished, Clara and Silas walked the edge of the pasture together, hands brushing. The earth was soft beneath their boots, the grass cool with dew. Coyotes called far off in the hills. "You ever think about the future?" she asked. Every morning, Silas replied. "What does it look like to you?" He stopped, turned to her. "It looks like this. A home. A woman who doesn't flinch from fire. Maybe kids. Maybe not. But definitely peace. Earned peace." She nodded. "Me too." She stepped closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "I spent so long thinking my story ended with what Bo did. That the worst of it was who I'd always be. And now I know I was never broken," she said. "I was just buried. And sometimes you don't find out who you are until you claw your way back through the dirt." He kissed her forehead. "You ain't just come back. You've become." In the distance, dawn hinted at the edges of the sky, streaks of silver and violet threading through the black. Clara turned back toward the house, hers now fully. Not because her name was on paper, but because her roots were in the ground, deep and steady. The land held her. The man beside her steadied her. But it was her own heart that carried her home. And as the stars faded and morning broke open, Clara knew one truth above all others: you don't have to be unbroken to be whole. You just have to keep choosing to stay. And she would. Every damn day.